How do we know what we know about the hazards that pose a potential threat to us, or about disasters that have happened or that might happen? This is a question that social scientists care about when they study disasters. Think about the Chicago heat wave, for example. You'll recall that the mayor of Chicago at the time, in the face of hundreds of deaths, said, quote, "It's hot, but let's not blow it out of proportion," unquote. So there was even disagreement over whether the heat wave was actually a disaster and what kind of response was appropriate. So we could ask about this heat wave, how the media, how the government, how medical systems interpreted what was happening, how they responded to it, and how they portrayed the event to the public. Now, why would we care about this? Because the beliefs that groups of people hold are important, because beliefs shape actions. Today, we are looking at collective perceptions of hazards and how these perceptions have shaped actions in British Columbia. And we're going to do this by using a social constructionist approach, which will help us to understand how groups of people collectively create their reality. If I do my job well in this lesson, then by the end of it, you should be able to explain what social construction theory is, how to use it, why it matters, trace how collective perceptions of hazards can be socially constructed, describe some Indigenous and settler colonial perceptions of flooding in British Columbia, and appreciate the significance, power relations between, and potentialities of these perceptions. And in doing so, acknowledge Indigenous relationships to land as fundamental to perceptions of certain hazards. Throughout this lesson, here are the key concepts to pay extra attention to: social construction of reality, Thomas principle, settler colonialism, and Indigenous relationships to land. Our first example of social construction is maps and map making. Now, humans love to draw lines and create categories, and this is a fundamental part of map making. But all lines and categories hold assumptions. What we're looking at here is the US Mercator Map. Now, this was used across the United States in schools for most of the 1900s. So that's a whole century of education based on this particular map. And now a map fundamentally, no matter what map you're talking about, is a projection. Making a map is the job of turning a three-dimensional object, the Earth, which is round, into two dimensions. And turning a three-dimensional object into two dimensions requires choices that distort shapes and land areas. What are some assumptions? What are some assumptions or choices that went into the creation of this map? I'm going to give you a minute. Okay, so the first thing most people point out is what is at the very center of the map here. So the east-west centering is North America, particularly the United States. And in order to achieve this, something else kind of quirky had to happen, which is that you have Eurasia here, which is split in half. Now, we could have chosen to split the map in half anywhere, but this is the choice that was made. And because of that, there's also an overcompensation going on here. So let me ask you, where is India? Some of you might say, oh, well, of course, India's over here, and you would be correct. But some of you might say, well, India's over here, and you would also be correct. So India is put twice in order to make this placement make sense. And then we can also talk about size, the relative size of different countries and continents. So Greenland looks massive. It looks like it's the same size as all of South America, but Greenland should actually be 1/8 of South America, and it should be 1/15 the size of the African continent. And this enlargement of Greenland and some other parts in the northern hemisphere is because the equator is placed a little bit too low, so it downplays the southern hemisphere compared to the northern hemisphere. Now, if you're really interested in this, you can go to thetruesize.com and you can click on different countries to see what their actual true size is versus how they're often represented. Now, here is another map of Indigenous traditional territories on Turtle Island, what we now call Canada. These traditional territories, and the ones that we can't see here, represent more than 630 First Nations communities. In 2021, there was a recorded 70 Indigenous languages spoken in Canada. And pre-contact, pre-settler colonialism, that was 450 or more Indigenous languages. And here's another map of Canada with a different set of assumptions built into it. And we can trace these assumptions back to British and French invaders taking unceded Indigenous territory. Now, I'm giving this lecture on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam First Nation, but you can't see that on this map. And now I'm going to place these maps next to each other. And essentially what we're looking at is the differences in representation of traditional territories and the current map of Canada. So what differences do you see between the map of traditional territories and the map of settler colonial Canada? And if you want to go more deeply into this, you can go to native-land.ca, which is an interactive map where you can actually adjust the settings for territories, languages, and treaties. Okay, so some of the most striking differences between these maps are the degree to which territories overlap. On the left, we can see that traditional Indigenous territories often do overlap. You can see colors on top of other colors, so that represents multiple First Nations in the same territories. We also see that the boundaries are fluid. There are a variety of shapes, and they're not just rigid lines. And these boundaries cross what we would see today as national borders, provincial borders, and territorial borders. So, for example, the United States would be somewhere around here, separating the line between Canada and the United States. So, for example, these territories cross between the United States and Canada, because those nation-state boundaries didn't exist. They were colonial creations. And many of the territories include offshore territories and waterways, which is not the case with the contemporary colonial map. And these maps don't just contain assumptions, they also tell us a bit of a story of colonial land use, the imposition of colonial land use. These traditional vast territories signal a great deal of movement throughout the seasons and throughout the year, in alignment with cyclical weather patterns, as opposed to the imposition of stationary farming, where you would stay in one spot and tend the same land over and over. And we can see the colonial imposition of First Nations reservations as a shift in relationship to the land and land use patterns. And this goes hand in hand with beliefs and rules about private property under capitalism. So these maps help us understand how colonialism involved changing social relations and institutions as well. So let's step back and talk about the broader theory of social construction. This is an idea that was articulated in a famous book called The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckman in the 1960s. And put very simply, they said social construction operates through 4 processes. First, people classify experience. And we're talking here not just about an individual person, but an entire group of people that begin to share a collective reality. So people classify experience. They define this piece of land or that piece of land as belonging to a particular category. Like this piece of land is part of British Columbia, which is part of Canada, which is defined in opposition to other provinces or other countries. And then people start to act on the basis of those classifications. So the categories of British Columbia and Canada become codified into law, and there are institutions built around them, like the government of Canada. And then you would have people that enforce those classification systems. And then gradually over time, especially over generations, those classifications get passed on, and the institutions they're part of become really formal and unquestionable. And people forget the social origins of these classifications, that it was actually a human choice to create these categories in the first place, to create British Columbia, to create Canada, to create the United States. And eventually, entire groups of people can come to see them as natural and unchangeable.